Brought to you by ABSA, a member of Barclays, in association with Business Leadership South Africa.
Hello and a warm welcome to another edition of NDP-A Plan in Motion. I'm Gugulethu Cele. Public-private partnerships have an important role to play in unlocking a country's developmental potential. The delivery of infrastructure through a partnership compared to the public sector doing it alone has benefits for the country as a whole. On this episode, we'll be discussing the role of PPPs and what that means, especially in the context of the National Development Plan. Joining me in studio to discuss this further, I have at the desk with me Edward Kieswetter, who's the Group Chief Executive at Alexander Forbes, Mohan Vivekanandan, who's the Group Executive for Strategy at DBSA, Godwin Khosa, CEO of the National Education Collaboration Trust, and Mike Upton, former CEO of Group 5. And joining us from our Cape Town studios is Andrew Boraine, who's the CEO of Western Cape Economic Development Partnerships, joining us in our Cape Town studios. And we also have a wonderful studio audience who will be participating in the discussion and probing the panel with their questions and sharing their views. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. This surely will make for a very interesting and vibrant discussion, especially given the fact that just a few years ago, when you look at the early documentation published on PPPs in the early 2000s, South Africa, together with some of its peers in Asia and Asia Pacific, were some of the top performers when it came to PPPs. We've fallen back slightly, but today, again, we had the WEF competitiveness report come out, where South Africa at least moved back into the top 50 competitive countries out of 140, moving from position 66 to 50. But in retrospect, when we look back and compare where we stand now, Edward, let's start off with you to get your opening comments. When it comes to PPPs in the South African landscape, how do we fare? Are we passing? Are we failing? Glass half empty or half full?
I think the glass is half full, but there's a risk that the level of the glass may drop further unless we address a few important issues. When we had successful partnerships in the past, those happened in a period where there was policy clarity from government, not mixed messages. Secondly, a very clear financial modeling in partnership. If I take the Gautrain as an example, if I take the Albert Tutu Hospital as an example, the N4 Maputo project corridor, all of those examples took place in a climate where there was good collaboration between the partners. And I think one of the reasons why the glass currently is half full, but risk dropping, is because we've lost some of that momentum. So that's the one point. The second point is, I think, recognizing that, and each of these points can be elaborated further, but recognizing that there's actually not a shortage of money. It is how we are able to attract and then direct those resources appropriately. And by that I mean, it doesn't only have to be a drain on public resources and on the fiscus. There is private sector money. I also serve on the ASISA board in the Economic Savings Planning Committee. And there we know that pension fund is long-term money, there's money available. And I think the third point I'd like to make at the outset is there are enough examples from which we can learn. If we look around, particularly if you look at countries like China, Singapore, South Korea, here are examples that if we look at them with the desire to learn, we can fast-track a lot of our learning and learn from both the successes and the mistakes they've made, and also learn from our own past examples.
Mohan, let's get your views. So on the back of what Edward has said, the potential for that glass to tip even lower.
Well, you know, I think the half full is a good analogy. And I think certainly PPPs do play a critical role around the National Development Plan and getting it going. You know, we're talking about some examples. A particularly recent, very good example is the Renewable Energy Program, where I believe to date something like 193 billion rands have been brought in to infrastructure investment into the country. And the vast majority, something like 90% of that, has been private sector investment. All the equity and the significant amount of the debt has been private sector. but it's been built on the policy clarity, some of the, a very open and transparent procurement processes that have been built in as well. So I think, as a country, we need to take that and replicate it in other models. And I think also, if you look at the fiscal situation in the country today, with our debt to GDP ratio closing on around 50% versus in the low 20s before the financial crisis, we're also in a position now where I think we're going to have to find ways to crowd in private sector, especially in those economically viable projects where there is offtake, and they can then come in, take the early stage risk, especially around building and then operating the asset, while the government maybe provides some of the offtake.
Godwin, let's get your views on opening comments on how we fare on PPPs.
Yeah, look, I think we're faring well, particularly in an area that runs along your hard infrastructure investment. Soft infrastructure investment is equally important. We have established a partnership between business, government, a labor and civil society that focuses on building the soft, infrastructure, skills, improving the quality of education, which is important for, for getting these, hard infrastructure investments off, as well as sustaining it over the longer term. And I must say that, all the sectors have come into the collaboration in a big way. Government for the first time has made its contribution available to an independent entity that receives, resources from the private sector as well. So in this case, I think the glass is close to full.
Close to full?
Yes.
Mike, I'm not too sure if you agree on that end from the construction sphere.
Thank you very much. I think, from the industry from which I come, the glass is half empty, to be honest. I think we've had a very robust sort of maybe decade in which there's probably been 4 or 5 major projects which have been successfully achieved, but there's probably 15 or 20 which have failed in terms of process or ideology or funding, or just the lack of capacity to be able to create an environment where a PPP becomes bankable. So the industry from which I come has got lots and lots of files and lots of tenders over many, many years, and probably tens of millions of rand worth wasted directly on infrastructure projects that didn't really get to an outcome. And that's not because they weren't going to be bankable. I think it's because of ideology. It's because of policy or lack of clarity, and then I think also because of process. Now, all these things exist. They're just very fragmented at the moment. And I think we've gone backwards as a country in terms of being able to access the huge amount of private appetite for debt and equity. And it's been lying there, lazy money. And yet, I think ideologically, we seem to want to build all the infrastructure using the fiscus, and it's just not possible. So I think there is a time for a change in mindset. A lot goes back to the history of the country and of our sort of industry in recent sort of 5 or 6 years, I'm sure. But I think until such time as our sector, from which I came, and government can find each other, I don't think you're going to get infrastructure of the scale that's needed in the time scale that's required. I think that's my concern.
Andrew, let's come to you in our Cape Town studios. You've heard the sentiments of your peers here in Johannesburg, but what are your views on how we fare when it comes to PPPs at the moment?
Well, I would immediately like to broaden the discussion beyond PPPs or funding of infrastructure through PPPs. I think that's one part of it, but it's only a small part of implementing the NDP. I think if I was to start with the NDP and say it's a very good plan, and it's a good plan for 4 reasons. One, it's got legitimacy. It went through a solid process of consultation. It's evidence-based. It was drawn up by a neutral and credible platform, drawing on skills from all over the country, from many different walks of life. And the plan itself is an explicit whole-of-society partnering approach. But then it stops. And its grievous flaw at the moment is that effectively the plan, which is a whole-of-society plan, is handed over to government departments for implementation, effectively disempowering business, disempowering civil society, and, if I may add, disempowering subnational government, provincial and local government. And I think that there needs to be a much more explicit partnering approach to implementation of the NDP, which includes funding of infrastructure, but it goes way beyond that. And the analogy I'd like to give is that the UN recently adopted this last week 17 Sustainable Development Goals for the world. And the 16 areas describe what the globe, or all the countries that are signatories there, want to sign on to. And the 17th goal is implementation through partnerships. And I think we should be taking our cue from the way in which the UN has handled the Sustainable Development Goals.
If we can follow through with that theme, and here at the desk, maybe Mohan and Mike, if you can both weigh in on this one. The key theme that I see coming through from the opening sentiments is certainly clarity. We need clarity when it comes to these policies, and like Andrew has mentioned, we want more partnerships, but how do we go about it? When it comes to the procurement process of PPPs, it's the identification of the particular projects, the feasibility study, then procurement, and then delivery and the management thereof. Where are we falling short? Should we be focusing on the hard infrastructure that's needed for the development here, soft infrastructure skills as well that Godwin alluded to as well, or should we be looking at strictly commercial and bankable projects that the private sector can actively participate in? Gentlemen, your views. Mohan, let's start with you.
You know, from our side, as a development bank focused around infrastructure, we look at the various sectors, and what we say is what's required in a given sector. So, you know, I spoke about the renewable energy area, but you know, we could look, let's say, at water infrastructure as well. And we're in discussions with entities like Business Leadership South Africa and National Treasury Qatar around how do you improve water infrastructure, especially in the mid-sized and smaller cities. And the challenge there is they don't have the rate space to completely pay for the expansion and then the upkeep of the water infrastructure, especially the water treatment plants and such. So on the one hand, Business Leadership South Africa, as an example, is able to bring through the business side to say, you know, we've got the expertise to do this. And in fact, you know, there is quite a bit of money that gets allocated on an annual basis through these infrastructure grants from the fiscus. But the reality is, if the people that had to directly benefit had to pay for it, they're not going to be able to do that, especially in these smaller municipalities. They just don't have the rate space to do that. So you do need the public sector, especially national government, to come in and almost act as a backstop to pay for this as well. So even before you get into individual projects, because you know you've got something like 280 odd municipalities, and many of them will need them, what you need to do is to have a plan that goes through at a countrywide level to say this is how we are going to fund this, but also this is how we will crowd in the private sector in taking some risks as well, especially around the planning and then the delivery of that infrastructure. So it is that very early stage, even before a project gets identified, is, you know, that policy certainty I think Mike was speaking about, but also around then, you know, what are the mechanics of it? Because somebody's going to have to pay for this, you know, and we do have a lot of that expertise in the private sector, but they are going to want to get paid. So, you know, and in a lot of these situations, those entities don't have that ability. So that is a big, big challenge.
Mike, if you could weigh in with your view on this particular matter. Positive examples certainly being drawn from the Independent Power Producers Project.
Very successful project, absolutely. But I think in terms of the experience which I bring as well is that we don't really have a master plan yet, you know, for water, for power and all those things. It's embedded in the NDP. But at the moment, from what we've seen, that there's lots of pockets of need, whether it be water or power or roads, and those who sort of initiate those projects are not well versed in how to put a sort of PPP together, bankability, the technical research and all that sort of thing. So it comes through a process to a central sort of treasury unit, which is a very well-run part of the treasury.
Despite it being quite small, though.
It's very small, but there it stops because quite a lot of things are missing. So that all this process goes on. There's a need, there's money, absolutely money for it, but we're not joining the dots in terms of actually a proper process, well documented, against a master plan as to how these things can actually be, you know, more effectively sort of implemented down the line.
Do we need to highlight and maybe identify particular projects where the capital is ready to go into? Like I said, is it back to the soft skills and education, or should we be focusing on energy, where we know there's a significant deficit at the moment, together with infrastructure? Is that what the pension funds are eagerly awaiting for?
I think, first of all, I'd like to touch on a point Godwin made earlier on, which is focusing on the hard but also the soft infrastructure. And if you go back to the underlying tenet of the NDP, it's ultimately about improving people's lives, whatever we do. And so it must be people-centered, whatever and we often miss the opportunity. The reason why the integrated, the 2 gigawatts of renewable energy is working is because of the level of collaboration and opportunity and the clarity from the beginning. Let me take an example of the How train, where we've missed an opportunity. And there are many examples in the world where the whole notion of this hard and soft balance is key. How do you bring people in? Because people are consumers, people bring skills, people therefore form both part of the supply chain as well as the demand chain. And you develop an integrated supply-demand side value chain. So if you think of the How train, there's a huge station at Marlborough. There's a community right there that is in need of jobs and just basic community activity. And I'm sure that the initial plan was more integrated than what we are. But can you conceive where we have sold the rights around the train line, the rights at each station, the air rights, and commercialized it with retail activity that would create both the opportunity for people locally there to come and work, but also to consume. And so immediately we have impact on the local community, just by the way we conceptualize these projects. And I think sometimes when you build a road, you build it because you think that it has to be financially sustainable, and you think of those people who will travel on the road, as opposed to thinking about those people who could live alongside the road and not just create traffic, but create communities. And I think we have to lift our game towards creating more community-centered, integrated projects that crowds in not just money, but crowds in supply and demand. The second point that I just want to make very quickly around these issues, and comes back to how we fund this, is we have to also, and I know government is grappling with this, but we have to move faster in sourcing in more money. Government has a huge asset base in terms of over 700 state-owned enterprises, not all of which has to be owned by government. So I imagine a world where we could list many of those assets or make private equity available, opportunities available, and then use that capital and fast-track some of the other projects.
Indeed. I'd like us to come back and view that. Godwin, you had comments and were nodding your head as Edward was talking.
I mean, the NDP provides a big vision and some specific areas where we should be focusing on as South Africans. I think the gap between this big vision and successful implementation, one is on working on the relationships, two, providing information that will enable the players to make the right decisions in implementing the big vision, and three, creating capacity to facilitate the actual implementation of these important projects. I mean, a case in point is the National Education Collaboration Trust. So we've worked on the relationships, we've brought in the key players, and we said, what are our roles in this space? How can we be working together? Secondly, the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. Thirdly, a structure was put up to specifically facilitate the implementation of Chapter 9 of the NDP, at least the part that deals with basic education. And therefore, we can see some specific things being followed through. Unlike leaving it broad, these things have to be planned for. There's got to be capacity to plan it, follow it up, and make sure that the different players continue to play their roles.
That's worked effectively in that particular department, but it goes back down to the mistrust as well, not so, that we also need to address with regard to the private sector and public sector. So getting together at the desk is one thing, but the actual implementation, another threat, Godwin?
Yeah.
Indeed. Andrew, let's get your voice in on this particular part as well, that clarity, before we move on to the capital raising initiatives as well. Communication is one thing, sitting at the table together is another, but dealing with the mistrust and ensuring that all particular parties understand the roles and responsibilities that they'll be playing. Are there particular lessons that we can learn from some of the successful projects as well highlighted earlier on the desk?
Well, I think trust is built in two ways, if I can address that point. The first one is dialogue and openness of the conversation, and it's at a fairly low state at this particular juncture in our history. But far more important is trust in action. There's nothing like a bunch of people, organizations, institutions, spheres of government working together and achieving something together, because that's at the end of the day how you build real trust. It's when you've done something together, not just talked about it, because talking and dialogue can carry on, and people get cynical, they get frustrated, and when there's nothing coming out of it, whether you're from civil society or business, you just walk away from that dialogue with government. I would also like to say that I don't think the starting point is to say which are the government projects that need to be funded by crowding in the private sector. I think that's part of the equation, but I think the starting point is a threefold one. It's firstly, what is government mandated to deliver? Secondly, what does business need to operate effectively? And thirdly, what does civil society want to achieve? And when you can work out the overlapping interests between those three sectors, and in a sense find the sweet spot between those three, you can get effective implementation of delivery. When there's a disjuncture between what business needs to operate effectively, what civil society wants to achieve, and what government is mandated to deliver, then you get blockages, and then you get sort of frustrated dialogue going round and round and round.
Andrew, I'd like to stay with you for a moment before coming back to the desk. Another element that gets thrown into the mix when it comes to policy clarity has to be other policies and the cohesion thereof. Transformation is certainly top of the agenda when it comes to the ongoing economic development of the country. Does that also add further strain to these potential partnerships?
Transformation is at the heart of the National Development Plan. And there's got to be a consensus reached between, again, what government wants to achieve with that. Business needs transformation to operate effectively. There's no ways that business can oppose that, although sometimes they do. And civil society also wants to achieve that. So there's no reason why transformation can't be at the sweet spot between overlapping interests between the three sectors of society. At the moment, it's set up as a kind of either or, a sort of one side versus the other side, and that's just not helpful. I think we've got to get on with it and accept that we've got to implement transformation because it's in the interests of all three sectors.
Well, let's come back to the desk now just to get views on this. Godwin, I'm not too sure if you had a comment on the transformation element, because that also plays a part in skills development.
Well, it somewhat links with that. I mean, we've been talking about the role of government, civil society, and the private sector, and I think we're leaving a very important and distinct, category of players, which is labor. Labor has to come, on board. So when we talk about collaborative efforts, towards improving this country, I think we have to have a space where, business, government get into a pact of some sort on those important projects, with labor.
Hopefully we can see that also being done, because I take it that would also bring confidence and certainty and clarity as well to the individuals who have the capital. Indeed? Yeah,
I mean, someone once said capital is a coward. And what that means is, everyone, whether you're an individual saver, whether you're a government or a private sector, you look for a positive return on capital. The difference between government as an investor and private sector is government has a balance sheet. It can amortize a project over infinity, okay? Whereas business has to amortize and recover the return on the investment in shorter cycles, which is why I think when you conceptualize a project, I think the point that was made earlier is government must be prepared firstly to take more risk at the beginning than it expects the private sector to do. Secondly, must create the opportunity for private capital to come in with the issues we've mentioned. I'm not going to repeat, but the issues of certainty and partnerships and transparency. Thirdly, it must allow the opportunity for private sector and itself to recapitalize, because that's how money keeps flowing into new projects. And then fourthly, as I said, think about it in an integrated way, building both the soft and the hard infrastructure around it, so that you have many examples around the world. India, for example, had at one stage, I don't know what is recently, the highest level of electrification, but the lowest level of connections because of unaffordability. Yeah. So building infrastructure that cannot be consumed in an affordable way by people then again disrupts that value chain between supply and demand. The last point on this particular matter is we have a great example, and I know this is politically sensitive in many quarters, in the Sanral Road project. I mean, we drive around, we enjoy great roads in Gauteng. Now, one aspect of it we need to learn from is how do we manage that early part of how we fund it. But the execution of this is world-class, and we have to learn from that.
Well, we're going to take a short ad break, but when we do return, we'll delve into further issues with regard to public-private partnerships here in South Africa, capital raising, potential listing of state-owned entities, as Edward listed earlier on. We'll delve into that and so much more right after this. A warm welcome back. We do continue our discussion on the role of public-private partnerships within the National Development Plan. I'm still joined in studio by my guests, Edward Kieswetter, who's the Group Chief Executive at Alexander Forbes, Mohan Vivekanandan, who's the Group Executive for Strategy at DBSA, Godwin Khosa, CEO of the National Education Collaboration Trust, Mike Upton, former CEO of Group 5, and in Cape Town, Andrew Boraine, who's the CEO of Western Cape Economic Development Partnerships. While we continue with our conversation together with the studio audience who will participate shortly during the Q&A session, but I want us to delve into the financing that was mentioned at the top of the show. No shortage of money, which we clearly understand. We've got the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We've got pension funds as well that you alluded to. But to comment on the issue with regard to state-owned entities, particularly potentially being listed, some might say, why would that be necessary when we've got institutions and all this excess capital available in the market? Edward, if you could give us your views further.
I think our challenges and the amount of funding we need is huge. And therefore, we need to explore all ways of introducing new funding. And I mean, you have to ask the question, why would government fear bringing private sector ownership into a state-owned enterprise? No one can pick the thing up and carry it away. It's always going to be there, firstly. Secondly, government can carve out a role for itself to protect its own interest. And it can provide, I mean, in the case of the Gautrain, for example, which was also another good example, government came in and provided some guarantees and some certainties, for example, an underpin in terms of usage. So government has the ability to protect its own interest, but also balance its interest with the interests of private sector investors. The issue, though, is that we have to pass through this barrier which up until now has just prevented the dialogue. And I know that that is changing. My request and plea would be that we accelerate that dialogue to bring into play that funding. Because whilst there is development funding through institutions like the DBSA and IDC and other state-sponsored development or funding agencies, I think there is also a greater inclusion opportunity into the economic well-being. So imagine that I'm not only a consumer of a rail service or a power generation plant, I'm also an investor therein. So again, I come back to this overall inclusion of the broader community and society into infrastructure projects that benefits us all. It takes off the burden of government at supplying that funding, and it invites greater inclusion and participation. You're not going to burn down a power station or a road if you own it.
Precisely, exactly. But I also want to get your view, Mohan, on if you can give us insight into the relationship and the amount of understanding. I think clearly as a financial institution you deal more with the private sector, but is there a greater awareness of the kind of projects that you're looking to fund, and more importantly, how PPPs fit into that particular mix?
Yeah, I think it is a bit of a mix. You know, whether it's a more economically viable project or even a social one, in both of those cases, you could be doing it in a PPP basis. I think on the economic one, it could be one where, you know, it could almost be owned by the private sector and they're just providing that as a service. But whereas in the social side, the full offtake would have to be guaranteed in by the state. And I think those are some of the differences involved. But I do agree, especially, you know, if you look at the numbers, the amount of money that the state is spending on infrastructure has started slowing down. It used to grow at almost 10% per annum in the early part of this decade. It's now pretty flat. against a state where, the inflation is still running around 5-6%. So in real terms, it may actually be declining. And so it is really crucial to bring in the private sector funding. And I think, the state can play a role in more of the social infrastructure, opening up more of the economic infrastructure, and go on from there. I think what we also try and do is put more of our efforts in the earliest stages around funding some of the pre-feasibility studies, the feasibility studies, to get a project to bankability, and then hopefully at that stage, our contribution may only be 10% of the full capital requirement.
Just on that, Mohan, how risky is that, working the project up to bankability? Because isn't that where a lot of the pitfalls actually occur?
It's very risky, but that's why there is the gap in that market, and that's then our role, we believe, as a development bank, to go and step in. Our figures right now show that maybe 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of those projects come through to fruition. So effectively, if you fund 3 or 4 of them, the majority are going to fall away for a variety of different reasons. They may not be technically feasible. The offtake that you thought was there isn't there. The political consensus behind that falls away. And not just in South Africa, also in the rest of the continent. We've seen those risks. But we feel comfortable taking that risk because we would rather invest our rand in that kind of earlier stages and then just put a little bit more into the financing as opposed to have to do the full financing element ourselves. Because if you can get that project and properly bank it, as it were, it's much easier to crowd in the private sector.
A headache or an opportunity here, I take it because they're very different experiences from the industry that you previously represented, Mike, together with you, Godwin. But let's start off with you, Mike.
I think it's, what Mohan said is absolutely very important because quite a lot of these early stages don't happen, and therefore you've got lost opportunities in terms of projects. Only in the last maybe 3 or 4 years which we've seen funding for the feasibility phase, and that's absolutely, it's the open door to further funding for many more sort of projects going forward. But if that doesn't happen, we can talk about these things forever, that it won't get bankable, in which case it won't happen. So it's key, absolutely key.
Godwin, your views?
Look, I think across, commercial, as well as social development PPPs, it's important to consider a full range of inputs that we need to put in for these projects to be successful. In most cases, we focus on the financial and material inputs, but there's technical inputs. So throughout the stages, through the proposal developments and assessment of bankability of the project, you gotta have to get the right technical inputs to get these things to work. But a point I want to stress even more is social capital investment. So whether it's with the user fee, highways, social capital investment right from the beginning, making sure that you have the necessary social capital investment would sustain these sorts of ventures. Yeah.
How would the private sector though continue to respond to that, given the fact that they have shareholders that they're accountable to, need to ensure that their profits and dividends that are paid out at the end of the day? Again, it's a tricky task to walk it, not so? Mike, you agree?
Oh, exactly. That's why it goes back to ideology. There must be a risk or sort of pain sharing and gain sharing, if you like. But when it comes to a sort of private sector money which needs to make a return, those are the projects which need to be bankable and have a return, leaving more fiscus money for the social projects, if you like, or long-term projects which may only be bankable in 15 years' time. So that's the ideology that needs to be cleared up, I think. Not everyone is going to have a project to which can make a return, but the country needs basic infrastructure. That's where the fiscus comes in.
Exactly. Yeah. Andrew, let's get your comments just before we head to the studio audience on the back of some of the feedback coming through with regard to financing and sorting out those ideological projects which often get caught up in the mix and confused when it comes to PPPs.
Starting off from a slightly broader socio-economic development point of view, rather than just on the infrastructure financing side, it's obviously desirable if there's a shared vision amongst all the parties, be it business, be it labour, civil society and government. At the moment, I don't think we have a shared vision. We have a number of competing visions. But I think notwithstanding that, you can still get organizations and institutions from different sectors to work together if you have a common agenda which says, despite our differences, we're going to work together on education or on health or on infrastructure or on the oceans economy or whatever it is. And then you can kind of put ideology and politics to one side and work on a common agenda. The trick, however, is how you translate that common agenda into joint action plans, because the devil is in the execution. You don't want to set up dialogue and forums where you just talk together and then go home in your separate ways. You want to actually work together. And I think the one thing we've experienced is that the public sector and the political leadership often talk a very different language, literally speaking, to that of business and that of civil society. And sometimes you need to bring in the translators, because if institutions from different parts of our society are speaking different languages, then you will never find each other. We will never find each other. And I think that there's a role for intermediary organizations, there's a role for partnership brokering organizations, which helps the different institutions in society find each other. At the moment, everyone is speaking a different language and getting very lost in translation.
Quite right there, the likes of NetLink, exactly. Well, let's cross to our studio audience where there is a question. If you could please state your name and which company you represent and pose your question to the panel, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My name is Shiva from Alexander Forbes. And I have questions. The first question, really, I think there is consensus around the practice of PPPs and some of the successes and not so good stories. But what I want to understand from the panel, which hasn't been talked about, is the role of government procurement and how it has helped or hindered the extent to which PPPs could have succeeded or could succeed in the country. And then the second question is the role of DFIs. This is specifically to DBSA. Do you believe that development financing institutions are playing a role in ensuring that this crowding in of private sector investment is deliberately happening from DFIs, particularly when you consider the issues around initial risk and mitigation that is required? The final question is on, as much as we are talking about infrastructure, is to the panel generally to establish whether they see a role for PPPs in the way that we drive small and medium enterprise development.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your question, ma'am. Perhaps let's pick up with the first one with regard to the role of government when it comes to procurement. I'm not too sure who'd like to pick up on that particular theme or question coming through. Andrew?
Recent bit of research I saw, case study coming out of the city of Copenhagen, who wanted to procure an intelligent transport system. And they have as many rules through the EU as we do here in South Africa governing procurement. And they specifically wanted to know how they could get small businesses to work with large firms in the delivery of an intelligent transport system. So what they did is that they before they issued the tender, before they went through the formal procurement system, they engaged small business, big business, in other words, the suppliers of the services, in a pre-tender process. So strictly within the law, transparent, they actually paid people to participate in this process, where business and government co-designed the procurement, and then it was put out to tender through the normal channels. And I think those are the sort of innovations that we should be learning from other parts of the world, like the city of Copenhagen.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, thank you so much for that response. Maybe if we come to Mohan, the question with regard to DFIs, ensuring that you are playing a significant role when it comes to the capital raising initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, in fact, if you look at the finance minister, who's also the governor of the DBSA, he was very explicit in our AGM, stating he wanted us to play a very, very proactive role in crowding in the private sector in the work that we do going forward, especially around a lot of municipal financing opportunities. So what we're looking at now is, historically, we did a lot of on-balance sheet lending directly to municipalities, and what we want to do is move away from that, or we'll continue doing that, but do a lot more programmatic approaches where from the beginning we plan this out. One example that we're looking at is around municipal wastewater treatment works. There's about 970 of them in the country. About 1 in 6 of them generate enough methane that you could put in a cogeneration plant. Now there's no reason why that can't be run by the private sector. But what we need to do is to do some of the early stage work to figure out, is that in fact true, help do some of the pre-feasibility studies to do that. But also we need to work with National Treasury and COCTA to ensure that the right legislation is in place, allowing municipalities to procure these services beyond their 5-year mandates as currently exist. So there is some early stage work that's required. And once you do that, it's very, very easy to crowd in the private sector, both as providers of the technical skills and as providers of capital in doing that. And another example where we're doing this is, and also touching in the point about smaller and mid-sized entities, we were looking at setting up a fund to provide about 2 billion rands of capital to small and mid-sized entities for the small IPP program. So there's a program that DOE, the Department of Energy, has put in for procuring renewable energy below 5 megawatts in size, specifically because the larger programs have actually been too big often to crowd in and bring in smaller entities. So this is an example where the Department of Energy had some foresight around this, and now we're working to kind of set up a fund to provide capital at a reasonable basis as well.
Mm-hmm. Godwin, I'd also like to get your views on that one, especially when it comes to the SMMEs and enterprise development. You're dealing with education, building up skills, ensuring that there is a youthful population who will have the necessary skills to hold the positions that you hold today. Is that also a potential opportunity that we need to have a look into?
Yeah, I mean, look, the two points I would like to emphasize is that if we want to get the private sector actively involved in these sorts of collaborations, whether small or big, we ought to be clear about what incentives we're building into these programs or projects. In the case of social development funding or participation or collaboration, what we have observed to be very important in the past 2 years of existence is being clear about the expectations of private sector organizations playing in the sector. And if I could give you an example, I mean, if you look at telecoms have got some statutory requirements for licensing in respect to social development. So being clear about what expectations are there and building very clear incentives for the telecoms to come into play in the partnerships would obviously improve the partnerships in that case. What is a procurement challenge in the commercial deals for us is a funding challenge, and I think we would not have much success if we don't identify the key areas and make special provisions for funding. And I think the same applies for your procurement. I think from the NDP vision, there should be some special programs and projects that are pinpointed and for which procurement will be done differently. And at best, the likes of the DBSA or special entities should be set up to drive those specific initiatives. Otherwise, procurement happens in the traditional, normal way, slow or not the best way that government and the private sector would like it to happen. If there are special important programs from the NDP, then we have to have special provisions for procurement and funding of those, capitalizing of those programs.
Exactly. Clarity on that particular issue. Mike, I'm not too sure if you had a comment there before we go to the audience for another question. Fine. Perfect. We've got another question in the audience. If you could please introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you very much. Dion Viljoen, I'm from Alexander Forbes. The words trust and certainty came up a number of times, and clearly the private sector's governance framework is quite different to the public sector, and it mainly revolves around prioritization of stakeholders. Is there not a need for a much clearer governance framework for partnership, and why is it currently failing?
Indeed. Anyone in particular that you'd like to answer that question? I see on the table. Maybe we can cross to Andrea, but Edward, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think transparency and good governance is key, even in procurement. Again, coming back to the good example of the renewables, an open and transparent process right through from the RFP through to the final closure and award of contracts is very important. There are too many questions asked about the awarding of contracts. Local example, I don't know the details, but the Chancellor House Hitachi incident is just not helpful to building trust and integrity in the system. And that's not government on its own, that's government and private sector who has to understand. So it's not a finger pointing. Both parties have to build towards greater trust. But how you can be seen to be more is by being more public about these things, by having clear rules, and I agree with Godwin, have a very dedicated procurement process and greater inclusion of all stakeholders throughout the process. Involve the public, involve civil society. So at the end of the day, it's not government defending it or the final awardee service provider that defends it, but there are other agencies and public players. There's the public protector that can vouch for good governance and transparency through that. We've just got too many questions around this issue.
Indeed.
If we can use the experience of the National Education Collaboration Trust to answer the question about the key important ingredients for the success of partnerships, it's what we've learned in the past 2 years is that partnerships have to be maintained. The various players don't all of a sudden, get to see things the same way overnight. So the common denominator when the National Education Collaboration Trust was started was everybody had the energy. Everybody agreed that something has to be done. In the education sphere, everybody was enthusiastic. Everybody wanted to bring their pound of flesh. But that has to be maintained. So it's an ongoing process. The dialogue that Andrew was talking about, it's got to be an ongoing dialogue, build on something tangible. So you keep going back to the key players. Some of them start lagging behind. You sit down with them, understand what the issues are. And I think key to it is that we've got to be courageous. We've got to be able to say the most difficult things, although in the most diplomatic perhaps ways. But I think that's key to sustaining partnerships. We've got to be transparent. We've got to be courageous.
Yeah. If
things aren't right, if we think that we're not happy with certain aspects of the partnership, you say it. And it's got to be fixed as quickly as possible.
But just to come back, so I agree with that. What, however, builds and sustains relationship is positive experiences throughout. So the initial, and we are an active participant in the NECT, we're delighted to be so. But that ongoing interest will obviously be maintained by credible delivery of clear milestones and projects to create those successes that then reinforces trust.
Exactly. So quite clearly, ongoing communication, like you both say, and clarity that needs to be established. We've got about 4 minutes just before we wrap up the show today. But Andrew, I'd like to come to you to get your closing comments on the discussion that we've had today. And more importantly, I want us to move away with tangible, potentially implementable solutions that we can find to public-private partnerships, in particular from the organization that you represent.
Okay, well, we've been working on organizing partnerships for development for the last 15 to 20 years, and there's a number of very clear factors that lead to success or failure of partnerships. And I like the question from the audience about the need for a governance framework. It's very clear that you need a partnering methodology and framework. They don't just happen, or even if you create them, you can't sustain them. And just some of the tips and tricks that we've learned from the last 10 to 15 years. One is get the right people in the room. You need collaborative leaders rather than command and control leaders. Secondly, take your jackets off before you come into that room. If you all come in wearing your jacket, I'm from this sector and I'm going to bargain for my interests against your sector and I will win if you lose, that's a recipe for failure. That's distributive bargaining, which just doesn't find win-win solutions. And then thirdly, help your partners deliver on their mandates in a collaborative way. Don't try and take over their mandate, but actually build. A partnership is only as strong as the weakest link. So if you have a weak partner in a particular partnership, then everyone must help build that partner. You don't try and substitute for that partner. And the final point that we've learned is appreciation of independent thought. You can still work together even if you think you have a different ideological framework. Just tolerate that and accept that, and then get on with the delivery.
Very briefly, Mike?
No, I think it goes back to the beginning. Ideology, followed by policy and by process, and we need a champion. And we don't see that champion currently.
Mohan, very quickly, your views?
My perspective is I think we are in a good situation because some of the challenges we're having around the fiscal situation is going to almost force the opportunity for these public-private partnerships. So I think on both sides we must just grab this opportunity and run with it because there's going to be a lot more of these available.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll leave it there very briefly, gentlemen. Thank you so much for all of your insights and your participation in today's conversation. A big thank you as well to our studio audience for participating with their questions. And this conversation will certainly continue on Twitter as well, hashtag NDP 2015, and you can, 410 rather, and you can give us your thoughts on the private-public partnerships and the landscape in South Africa. A big thank you to all of my guests, Edward Kieswetter, who's the Group Chief Executive at Alexander Forbes, Mohan Vivekanandan, who's the Chief Group Executive for Strategy at DBSA, Godwin Khosa, CEO of the National Education Collaboration Trust, Mike Upton, former CEO of Group 5, and in Cape Town, Andrew Boraine, who's the CEO of Western Cape Economic Development Partnership. That's where we leave it. Be sure to join us again next time here on NDP.
Brought to you by ABSA, a member of Barclays, in association with Business Leadership South Africa.